Imagine if you had to create a program that displayed 1000 random numbers on your screen. That sounds like it would be a lot of code, right? Well, it definitely would be, but lucky for us, there's a simple way we can do this. This is where loops come in. With loops, we can create the code, write it once, and then tell JavaScript to repeat that code as much as we like. Think of a loop like a conditional statement, except that with a loop, our code keeps running until a certain condition is false. Then that loop is complete. The first type of loop that we are going to work with is a while loop. Let's look at the basic syntax for this type of loop. Notice how similar our while loop looks compared to our conditional statement? Now, let's create a program that uses a while loop in it, then we will review the code afterwards. So the first thing I'm going to do is set our condition for a while loop to run. Basically what this is saying, if x is less than 4, then run the loop. I'm going to make a simple document.write command and output some text to the page in this example. I'm going to add a plus here in our quotes to add a little bit of space in between each string that's repeated. And next, I have to actually declare our variable x and give it a value. We're just going to make it a value of 0 at the start. And of course, I need to add x plus 1 every time the loop runs. Once the loop runs 4 times, x will equals 4 and the loop will stop running. So with this code, our string will be outputted to the page 4 times. Let's give her a save and see what happens. Alright, we can see our text is entered 4 times here. What if, for whatever reason, we want to output this text more than 4 times though? Well, all we have to do is go into our code and change our conditional statement. Instead of having it 4, let's switch it to 500. Basically what this is saying, our loop will run 500 times until x equals 500, and then we'll break out of the loop this way. We can see that's a lot of text on the screen. Now, let's create an example with our JavaScript loop for a random number generator. Basically, we're going to make a program that will generate a long list of random numbers onto the screen. It's going to be very similar to the code we just made, but it's going to be a little bit more practical. So, to start things off, we're going to start off with our basic while loop. Once you have our basic while loop displayed, I'm going to make a counter, and I'm going to declare that counter as 0 at the start of the program. And then what we need to do is place our counter variable into our loop and increase it by 1 every time the loop is run. This is how we track the loop, so that once our loop reaches a certain point, we can break out of the loop. If we don't have our counter in our loop, then our program will just keep running the loop over and over again. This is called an indefinite loop, and it's not a very good thing in JavaScript. We always want a way to break out of our loop, just in case. Later on, you will actually learn a particular keyword that will let you do that, but for now, we're just going to use variables and numbers with our conditional statements to make our loop stop. So, we need to add our conditional statement in here. Let's put our counter and say if our counter is less than 50, then run the loop. Once our counter equals 50, then break out of the loop. I'm going to quickly steer our random number generator we used previously in the course. Check out the working with numbers section of this course if you're not familiar with this piece of code. Let's give our code to multiply our number by. Let's go with 100. We also need to give a variable for our random number generator. Last but not least, we need to create a document.write command, and we're going to output the random number that is generated to the screen. So here we have our variable counter equals 0, and then we have our counter is less than 50 while loop, and then we're adding 1 to the counter every time the loop is run. We're generating a random number, and then outputting that random number to the page. We're also going to add our space and our quotes just to add a little bit of space between our numbers here. Let's run the code and see what happens. Uh-oh, we seem to have a syntax error. Let's go through and see what the problem is. Oh, we can see here I misspelled document. Forgive me, my typing is not that great. Oh, that's not how we spell document either. Alright, so I think our program's good to go and we can see what happens. Alright, we can see our random numbers being displayed here. Pretty cool. Now, just like our last example, let's say we wanted to make thousands of numbers, and I mean a lot of numbers. How would we do this? All we would have to do is change our number in our conditional statement. Let's put a really large number here. I'm also going to demonstrate to you how fast JavaScript actually works. So the moment that I just ran our program, our JavaScript program just generated literally thousands of numbers, just like that. Pretty cool, eh? This is the power of JavaScript, and this is why loops are very important for running code over and over again. It also makes us be able to program a lot faster because we don't have to write our same programs and functions and all that over and over again. Now, the while loop is the first type of loop that you've learned, and as we go through this section of the course, you're going to learn a lot of different types of loops and different things you can do with loops. So just take this in for now, maybe think about how you can apply it to your programs you're using right now, and I'll meet you back in the next video of the course. Let's take a closer look at understanding and working with loops. So far, you have learned to work with a while loop, which will keep repeating itself until a condition comes true. If you remember in the last video, we created a program that had a counter that kept track of how many times our loop ran. If our counter reached a certain number, then our loop would end. In this lesson, let's go over a different method we can use to break out of a loop. In this lesson, we are going to create a simple program that asks a question. If the user gets the secret password correct, then they are gained access to our web page. If they get it wrong, they will get 3 more tries to get it right. If they don't get it right, then the user is locked out. So let's start our piece of code by creating a variable for counter, and we are also going to start our while loop. Inside our while loop, I'm going to create a variable for our secret question so that we can store the user's response to a prompt inside that variable. Let's go inside our prompt command here and type in our secret question. Because we're only going to give our user 3 tries to get the correct password, we're going to add our counter variable and add +1 to it every time our loop is run. Next up, we have to actually do the condition for our loop. So we're going to do something like if secret question is equal to our secret password, which is abracadabra, then this condition will be true and the loop will stop running. So if the user doesn't type in abracadabra, then the loop will repeat itself over and over again. Now we haven't quite entered in the code, but next we're going to add a code that's going to make this loop stop if the counter reaches above 3. So the way we're going to do this is with an if statement. Inside of our loop, we're going to have an if statement that says if counter equals 3, then run the following code. We're going to write a document.write message to the screen to let our user know that they have not gained access to our website. And then we're going to add a keyword that we haven't quite discussed yet, and we're going to go over this in future loop lessons, but for now we're just going to use it so we can show you guys an example, and this is the break command. Whenever we add a break command into our loop, it causes our loop to stop. So in this code, if our counter is equal to 3, then we have our document.write command, and then our loop will break out. Like I mentioned before, we will talk about the break command in further detail and breaking out of loops in a future lesson, but I just want to show you guys an example of how it can work in your loops. Alright, so the last thing we need to do with our program is create our if statement or conditional statement for when the user actually gets the password correct. So what we're going to do is we're going to write if secret question is actually equal to abracadabra. Then we're going to just simply put a document.write command to let the user know that they got it correct and they can now gain access to the website. One thing I do want to point out before we go any further is that this actual conditional statement is actually outside of our loop. So every time our loop repeats, it's not actually checking if our conditional statement is being met or not. So we're going to have to copy this section right here and actually paste it inside the loop. We'll just put it right underneath the second part here. So now our statement is actually checking every time the loop is run if the user got the correct answer or not. So let's run our code, save it, and see what happens. Okay, so we're prompted. Let's actually type in, whoops, that's not the right secret password. I have it saved here because I actually don't know how to type abracadabra. So we'll just copy that and paste that in, there we go. Alright, so we can see that our secret password is met. Let's type in a fake answer. And we can see after 3 tries, our program actually locks us out. So this is another cool way we can use loops to create programs that can do all kinds of different things. And this is a good example to show you guys another way how you can break out of loops when certain conditions are met. So we've talked and worked a lot with while loops. It's time to focus on a do while loop, which is the next type of loop you are going to learn in this section of the course. In this video, you are going to learn how to use another type of loop in your programs. This loop is called the do while loop, and it's very similar to the while loop. Let's look at the basic syntax of a do while loop. Now these two loops look pretty much the same, except that they have one main difference. Notice how our condition is at the end. This means that our code will run at least once, and then our condition is run after our code. This means that no matter what, a do while loop will run at least once. A while loop, on the other hand, is possible to not run at all. What's a good example of a do while loop? We can use a do while loop when we want to make sure something has to happen, like prompting a user for information, for example. We use the do while loop when you want to make sure that your loop runs at least once. That's the main use for it, really. Now let's create a program that collects a user's name. In order for the program to complete, the user has to submit their name no matter what. Follow along with me as I create this program. So, of course, we're going to start off with a variable. We're going to call it user's name, and we're going to use this variable to prompt the user and ask them for their name. Once we have our prep command all ready to go, we will now actually set our condition for our loop. So we're going to do something a little bit differently here. And we're going to take our user's name and we're going to add if our user's name is equal to null, or if user's name is greater than or equal to 0. And what this is doing is the null keyword stands for if the user cancels the prompt. So what happens here is if the user cancels the prompt, then the loop will run. We also added the equals to 0 and higher if the user leaves the field empty. So the user just can't hit OK and leave the text field empty. We're also going to write our document.write command for when the user does actually write their name. Now, normally you wouldn't do this because this creates a prompt box that is basically forces your user to type their name and nothing else. If they type in a number, or if they hit the cancel or leave the value empty, then the prompt will keep running. It's basically forcing the user to type in a string. But just for example's sake, let's save this program and run it and see what happens. Alright, here, so it's prompting me for my name. First off, I'm going to hit OK. And we can see that the prompt box does not go away. If I hit cancel, the exact same thing happens. We are basically forced to enter in a string here, and now the program can complete. So this is a prime example of a do while loop. We use a do while loop when we want to make sure that our code executes at least once, and then our condition is checked after that code runs at least once. Now you know how to use a while and a do while loop. Now let's look at the last type of loop you are going to learn, called a for loop. The last type of loop that you are going to learn how to use in this JavaScript course is called a for loop. A for loop is similar to a while and do while loop. The main difference is that a for loop can be used to run a loop a given number of times. In order to show you the difference between the two, let's take a look at a while loop and a for loop. You can see that the for loop is a lot more smaller and compact. This is why it is a very popular type of loop. Keep in mind, for loops are a little bit more complicated, so let's go over it bit by bit. First, we start off with the for keyword in a pair of parentheses. The first thing we do is declare the variable. This first declaration is only run once in a for loop. Next, we have the condition for the loop itself. The very last component would change the counter and add +1 to it every time the loop is ran. Lastly, we have our code that gets run in the loop. Essentially, these two loops are the same, just the syntax for them is different, and a for loop is a lot faster to create. For loops are very common in JavaScript. For loops may seem a little bit complicated to understand right now, but once you start working with them, you will be creating them with no problems whatsoever. Now let's create an example of a for loop. Let's generate some numbers on the screen. So we're going to start by creating our for loop. We're then going to add our counter variable and make it 0. Next up, we add the condition for our loop, and we're going to add a pretty big number here. And lastly, we're going to add our part that adds +1 to the counter every time the loop is ran. What we're going to do here is we're going to make a document.write command and just write out whatever counter means to the page. So our counter starts off as 0. The script will then print that number to the screen. The next time the loop is run, counter will be 1, and then the script will print that number to the screen. The main thing here is just getting used to the syntax for our new for loop. You can see that this code is a lot smaller than how we normally write a loop or other coding in JavaScript. This is why for loops are very common. They require less typing and are easier and faster to write. So now that our script is done, let's save it and give it a go. We can see here that our loop is running perfectly fine. Now that you know how to create 3 different types of loops, you're going to learn how to break out of a loop. Now we talked briefly about the break keyword in the previous lesson, but we're going to focus more on breaking out of loops since having infinite loops are always a bad thing in JavaScript. Stick with me for your next lesson on loops. You've learned about while, do while, and for loops. So far I've taught you how to break out of a loop using variables. For example, if counter equals 5, then stop the loop. Although this is the most common way to exit a loop, there is another way using the break command. Let's apply the break command into one of the programs we made. Let's change our loop so that it becomes infinite. Now this is usually a really bad idea, but let's use it just for this example. So looking at this loop, it will run forever because the loop will never become false. It always remains true. We can, however, add a conditional statement with a break command in it. Breaks can be helpful when the loops become more complicated and we are running lots of conditional statements inside of our loops. So let's add a counter variable in here, and we're going to add +1 to the counter variable every time our loop is run. And we're also going to create the variable up top here and declare it at the top of our script. We'll give counter the value of 0. Next up, inside of our loop, we're going to have our conditional statement, and we're going to make a conditional statement that's going to say if counter is over, let's say 50, then execute our break command. And what this will do is we'll break out of the loop. So we have this section of our code right here, which is going to be run every time our loop runs. So every time our loop runs, we have a conditional statement just checking to see if our counter is 50. And if it's over 50, then we break out of that loop. So this is another way to break out of a loop using the break command. If we run our program, we can see that after 50 loops, our loop will end. Now that you know how to work with loops, it's time to start the challenge for the loop sections of this course. Good luck, everybody. Alright, so it is now time for the JavaScript loop challenge. You're going to start noticing that our challenges are going to get a little bit more harder. Our scripts are becoming more advanced, and you're learning a lot more tactics in different ways you can add more features to your programs. So this is completely natural. In this challenge, you are going to have to learn how to do the following. Create a loop program where a user has to guess a random number that is generated by our script. the script must keep looping and prompting the user to type in a number until the user guesses the correct number. Have the script generate a number between 1 to 10, and record how many attempts it takes the user to guess the correct number. Print a message to the document when the user gets the correct number, and let the user know how many attempts it took them to find that correct number. Lastly, use a for loop for this example. Now, this challenge is definitely going to be the hardest one we have done so far, but again, I challenge you to try to complete this challenge on your own. If you're having difficulty or you need help, watch the next video where I will show you one of the many different ways that we can make this program work and bring it to life. Good luck with the JavaScript Loops challenge, and let me know in the discussion settings for this video how you did. Alright, so let's begin the JavaScript Loop challenge solution. The very first thing that we're going to do in our script is create our random number generator. So what we're going to need to do is generate a random number and store it in a variable. The variable that we're going to use is our number, just like the same random number generator we created in our other scripts in this course. Alright, so once we have our random number generator going, we can now create our for loop. Now remember, this can be a little bit tricky, but let's walk through this. So we start by typing in for, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create a temps variable and make it 0. We're also going to add our conditional statement here, which is basically saying run this loop as long as our user's answer does not equal our random number. Remember that the exclamation mark in the equal sign is saying not equal to. So as long as our user's answer is not equal to our random number that we're generating, then keep running the loop. Last but not least, we're going to add attempts plus 1 every time the loop runs. So we're adding plus 1 to the variable attempts every time the loop is run. Next up, we're actually going to create our prompt to prompt the user and ask them for their guess. This is where our user's answer is going to be stored in. So any number they type into the prompt is going to be added to user's answer. So the script will keep looping until the user guesses the random number, and that number is any number between 1 to 10. Now, because we want this loop to run indefinitely and never stop unless the user cancels the program, we don't need to add an else statement or anything like that. The script will just stop running once the user guesses the right number. Once the user guesses the correct number, we're going to create some document.write commands here and just output some information to the page. I'm also going to add a paragraph tag here, which is the P. This is a little bit of HTML, and what this is going to do is at the start of this sentence here, I have the first paragraph tag, and then at the end I have a closing tag, and any text in between is going to be given the paragraph element, which is just going to give it a little bit of styling. It's basically just going to make sure each document.write command is inserted on its own line of text, kind of indented like a paragraph. Once I run the script, you'll see more what I need. So we're going to let the user know that they guessed the correct number. We're also going to let them know what the correct number was. And then, last but not least, our last document.write command is going to tell the user how many attempts it took them to guess the correct number. Alright, so we're pretty much done our program here, and once you're done your program, let's take a quick look at this program and kind of walk through it step by step what our program is actually doing. So, the first thing up top here is we are generating a random number, and we're saving it into the variable random number, or our number in our case. Next up, we have our for loop, where we have our attempts equal 0, and then we have our user's answer is not equal to the random number. This is our conditional statement here. So as long as our user's answer is not equal to a random number, this loop is going to run. Last but not least, we add +1 every time the loop is ran. And this is our section of the code that gets run every time the loop is ran. Last but not least, we have a little bit of document.write commands to output some messages to the screen to just record some variables and let the user know how they did with this game. Once we have everything good to go, we're going to save the file and then test it out and see what happens. Let's see if we had any syntax errors or anything like that. Okay, so we see that the script is not running, and we must have a syntax error or something might not be right in our program. So let's take a quick peek and see if I can spot anything really quickly here. Alright, so I can see that we didn't capitalize the math.random command. This is a tricky one that used to get me a lot before. I always forget to capitalize math.random and math.floor. So let's rerun the program. We can see that's running perfectly fine. And we're going to go 1 to 10 until we get the correct number. We can see here that the first time we run it, it actually goes to 10. So we can see we guessed the correct number. Next we have another paragraph, and the correct number is 10. And then we have, it took you 10 to get the correct number. So we might need to add a little temps word here to make this sentence make more sense. But other than that, I think our program is pretty much good to go. So let's just quickly add this in there really quickly, just to make that line make a little bit of sense. And run the program. Let's guess again to see if it actually does work. And we can see this time that the random number was 3. So it only took us 3 attempts to get it correct. And then the user is notified that it took them 3 attempts. So that's pretty much it for this program. A little bit challenging, nothing crazy, but a simple random number guessing game where the user has to guess the correct number. Once you have finished this, let's move on to a quiz that will include all the information you have learned so far in this course. After we finish the quiz, we can start working with arrays and JavaScript.